Thank you. Thank you, Max, for that introduction, a musical introduction of the Internationale. Max is a high school student from Virginia, been playing saxophone 8 years. The International is a very song very close to my heart. Um, been through labor struggles throughout the years. I believe it was sang by Soviet troops as they liberated concentration camps in Nazi Germany. Welcome, friends. Welcome all. I believe we're streaming on YouTube via Caleb Maupin's Facebook page. This is the CPI web conference entitled CPI and the Socialist Future of America. I am Dust James, host of Dust James Anti-Imperialist America. You can find me on my Facebook page. You can find me on YouTube under Dust James. Just get in there and search Dust James Anti-Imperialist America. I do kind of like a vlog or what have you on socialism, similar to Caleb Maupin, our keynote speaker tonight. I'm just going to do a brief introduction about maybe where I'm coming from, the CPI, a little bit about this conference and why we got this fine group of folks together tonight. I guess in the spirit of dialectic materialism, I'll start with kind of a economic briefing. Times are hard right now for folks in America. My wife's cousins got one family living out on an enclosed porch and another one in a garage. It reminds me of Hoover. There was a saying back in the day during the Great Depression where Hoover was gonna put two cars in every garage, and they said, "Well, yeah, it's more like two families in every garage," and that seems what we feel like today under Trump. Trump said he was going to make America great again. He's overseeing the best economy that has ever happened. That's obviously a lie to anybody who's out here trying to struggle day to day. Folks are suffering. If you want to look at it more on a macro level, scientific level, what was the American labor aristocracy is coming to an end. U.S. empire is falling, and we need something new. The old myth that the United States is the best country in the world, that the United States always fights for justice and freedom, is obviously wrong to the world over and the people in the United States of America, and the oppressed people in the United States of America as well. And we need something new. We need new ideology. We need a new understanding. And as more people are not able to work and provide for themselves, we can put forth time and effort to develop new ideology and to fight. They say revolution comes in three phases. The first is an economic revolution. The second is a social, and the third is a political. We have gone through the economic revolution, the microprocessor revolution. Our jobs are being automated. Neoliberalism is taking out our services. Neoliberalism is creating masses of migrant crisis. And the Republicans are trying to shut people out and turn us against each other and scapegoat. And the Democrats want us to hate our rural neighbors, rural workers, that we should be standing in solidarity. The new ideology of the future is socialism. Socialism with solidarity. Unite and fight. Black and white, unite and fight. With this, it's going to take work. It's going to take struggle. You say socialism for lazy people. It ain't for lazy people. If you're going to go to work all day, provide for your family, come home and dedicate real energy and to build groups that mean something. Take yourself seriously. Put on a suit. Talk with your neighbors. Don't go to them and tell them exactly how they got to talk. We got to sell socialism to our neighbors. We got to go where they're at. We got to apply to their needs. Develop this new ideology. Ideology of socialism that fits America, that fits our neighbors. Socialism for us in the United States as American workers. And once we build this political power, we form new ideology. We inspire our neighbors. We inspire our friends. And as the system crumbles, we can build a better socialist America, a new America. So I guess that was my short introduction. We'll go on to our next speaker. We have Stuart Becker is going to be giving us an activist report. He's a teacher from Dallas, Texas. Thank you. Take it away.
Okay. Hi. My name is Stuart Becker, and I live in Dallas, Texas. I have been selling the CPI's edition of the Green Book with an intro by Caleb Maupin. I've also been selling Getting Rich Without Capitalism by Caleb Maupin. And it is critical to spread these ideas, I think, because the people and the working class need revolutionary ideology. So another thing I did with these books was I was also interviewed on a podcast in Dallas, Texas called An Hour with Crowder to discuss these ideas. But spreading revolutionary ideology, I think, is so important because it moves people to act and it guides their action. And this is why the work of the Center for Political Innovation is so important and so critical. And another thing, theory without action is empty, and action without thought is blind. So we must think in order to take action and act with thought and theory. So that being said, I have been getting involved in a new coalition in Dallas, Texas called Dallas Stops Evictions. So people in Dallas came together to do something about the current eviction crisis. It had to do with all of the people getting evicted or the high numbers of evictions. So we started organizing tenants through that. And we went to an apartment complex that was experiencing illegal evictions. And so far we have stopped 2 evictions from happening. We did this by providing people with the CDC paperwork that they can fill out so they don't get evicted. But the working class needs class struggle oriented organizations, in my opinion. These include workers unions, tenants unions, and unemployed councils. So these class struggle organizations fight for the rights of workers, and they fight for better conditions. And these organizations and unions help the working class and oppressed people build power. So, and also these organizations are the weapon of the working class and oppressed. So this is why we started tenant organizing. We have held 5 meetings so far at an apartment complex called the Astera Apartments. Some of the stuff we've been doing is canvassing the whole apartment, talking to people about the living conditions and asking them if they would like to be involved in organizing a tenants union to fight for a lower rent and better living conditions. And through this, we see that people are very supportive because people are suffering in bad living conditions all over Dallas. Like people are living with rats and roaches and black mold and bed bugs and excessive towing of cars and overall abusive management. So I think this is a really good thing to do at this moment because being involved in tenant organizing, I like to say this, being involved in tenant organizing, I would say is superior to mutual aid, such as giving away free food. Because when you give away free food, this doesn't really show the people how to work collectively to fight for liberation. But when you organize unions, such as worker and tenant unions, these class struggle oriented organizations, you teach people how to collectively act to take power over their own lives. So, and another thing that I want to give a report on is I have been organizing weekly Marxist study groups, and we have been studying basic Marxism. So first we talked about we've been studying the ABCs of Marxism. Then we went on to studying Marxist economics, and we studied other Marxist works such as The Origin of the Family, The Private Property and the State by Engels, The Communist Manifesto, Utopian and Scientific Socialism by Frederick Engels. We also studied Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and State and Revolution by Lenin. So I recruited people to come to these meetings by writing and printing out political education pieces and distributing them at protests and rallies and actions. And one piece I wrote was a revolutionary book list. So this included books that provide people with Marxist and other revolutionary ideology. But through these political education sessions, I have learned a lot, because I have been learning with some elder comrades, some elder mentors. And one idea that I have learned is that we must struggle with the working class in their every day-to-day battles. We must show the working class that these day-to-day battles are linked to the capitalist system, where profits are in command and where the major centers of economic power are organized to make profits for the elites. Also, we have to stress that communists are for the working class. We say the working class is the class of the future. We say that the working class should be the ruling class, and we have no interest outside of the working class. So thank you. That concludes my presentation.
All right, awesome. We're going to move on to the next speaker. Thank you. Okay, let me get to this other page. Okay, next up we have Michael Madden from San Francisco. He's on the labor subcommittee of RadStar. Sounded like a front insurgent group with progressive group within the Democratic Party. Thank you. Take it away.
Lord, well, okay. Thank you all for having me. Let me restate my introduction there. I do want to thank the CPI for letting me speak today, and all of you souls at home watching right now. So my name is Michael Madden. I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm in the Red Star Caucus, which is a local communist caucus in San Francisco. I'm also one of the two newly appointed chairs to the DSA's National Labor Subcommittee of the International Committee, which is tasked with international relations. What I want to do today is convey a rounded picture of the dynamics of what is actually happening internally within the DSA, right? Because it's a lot of things that, frankly, the left not involved in DSA doesn't talk about or know very well. That's what I'd like to do with my time, and I want to just jump right into it. What we've witnessed in the past 4 years is a ballooning of the organization under this kind of Sanders-friendly umbrella of social democratic ideas, right? Many people want to point to this as the reason for DSA's growth, right? But in actuality, the trigger for the explosion in membership was the election of Trump. It was the failure of the Democratic Party to get anything done about stopping Trump. It was after Trump that we saw what members were calling internally the Trump bump, as like a funny, funny joke. We saw this again later with the Black Lives Matter movement this summer. That is an increase in interested parties and in membership, as well as the current recruitment drive of ours to reach 100,000 members by the election in November. We are currently a 70,000, 75,000 member organization. That doesn't mean that all those people are active every day of the week, right? Some of them maybe make a once a month meeting. So to move on, this narrative of Sanders pumping up the organization was pushed by people with control and that have ties to things like Jacobin, for one, in large part, which does a good job, Jacobin magazine, of masquerading as DSA's official outlook and opinion on the world, even though it doesn't actually have organizational ties to it. It still has many on the writing teams and the staff involved in DSA. DSA has its own publication, Democratic Left, right, just for example. So there's a narrative out there that Sanders was one getting us all of this attention. He's responsible for all these people joining, and that participation in his campaign was going to yield wide results when he was inevitably cheated out of the nomination, right? Well, that didn't happen. And those numbers partially materialized, but not in the way that it was hyped up. For example, there are national caucuses in DSA, right? We've got things like Bread and Roses, Socialist Majority, are two large reformist caucuses who have essentially run with this logic for their own benefit. Now, this is interesting to me because I actually know people in these caucuses, and they're very well-educated Marxists. So it's strange. There's really just an interesting divergence of opinion. But they are known for doing things like back-channel arrangements, skirting around national resolutions, basically maintaining an informal network of control via undemocratic appointments and holds on seats in the organization in order to maintain their control. So now this plan started to crack up. It was now in the process of evaporating because more and more insiders in the organization were becoming aware of what was going on with them. So the failure of the Sanders campaign kind of revealed this. The reformist wing of the DSA is now on the back foot. They don't have anything outside of local city reforms really to offer the membership. And these Joe Biden arguments are now surfacing inside of the organization. The Socialist Majority Caucus recently circulated a petition gathering support to defeat Trump, right? But if you read the language, it's clear they're asking people to skirt around our convention and convention resolutions without saying his name, ask membership to sign on to a pledge that basically results in a get out the vote effort for Biden, right? This is not popular with our membership. So if it betrays our convention decisions, our resolution on the 2020 elections that no other candidate was to be endorsed or aided via the resources of our organization election in 2020. So the ongoing project, right, is a construction of a left wing inside of DSA. 4 years ago, this originally united many local communist groups around a national caucus known as Refoundation in the early DSA convention after 2016. Pardon me. But since then, for various reasons, the network dissolved. But this can mainly be put down to the fact that these collection of groups didn't have sustainable bases in their own localities, right? However, these groups still operate on chapter levels. Some still maintain broad national caucuses. Oh, am I already over time?
No, continue.
Okay, wonderful, thanks. I looked at the chat and got distracted. But yeah, give me a heads up. Wonderful. Since then, right, for various reasons, this network dissolved, not based in local groups, as effectively as it should have been. But we are regrouping our collective efforts for next year's convention within DSA. So there's already a meeting and planning in the works for this. These groups are engaging with each other again. Some of us have constituted an editorial board shared between 4 of the communist caucuses, which I sit on. It's rather a lot of editing, but it can be fun sometimes. Red Star members, and I'm talking about San Francisco here, SA members, helped organize the Anchor Steam Brewery in San Francisco. They organized a local vet hospital that's run by the Mars Corporation here. They unionized the Tartine Bakery here, very famous, profitable bakery franchise, right? Known at a few locations in California. Most of this work was done by skilled, experienced union organizers who are members. Also, it was assisted by our labor organizing committee in San Francisco, which is set up to direct people towards support for these campaigns, right? I sat on that committee. I was its head for a brief moment for a year. But each time there's a failure of reformist planning, each time anarchist tendencies within the organization fall short of creating the force needed to focus on a campaign, each time there's an argument over charity work versus worker organizing, we win people over to our position. They join our caucus. So it's a slow but sure process. And about 1/2 or maybe 2/3 of this membership, right, are liberals and anarchists, people whose personalities benefit the most from a devolved committee structure, from disorganization, from decentralization, right, things that communists don't normally jive with. Liberal ideas of individual freedom, do what you want and not have centralized, focused command structure. And they think somehow that's magically going to throw up the conditions for a better world, right? On the other side are the communist caucuses who slowly benefit as members go through their own lived experience of dealing with our internal politics and are won over to our side, not even necessarily because of our political positions, but because we substantiate a lot of visible leadership. We take leadership positions, And so we form trust, we form bonds, relationship building. San Francisco's Red Star, although it's a small membership, almost exclusively SF members, our caucus is looked to by many contacts across the US because of our successful chapter work, because of our analysis, our writings we post to our sites, the fact that even though our platform is very broad, in order to collect disagreeing communists together, right, is more specific than probably any of the other Communist Caucus platforms. And so we've been specific in that program since 2016 about the need for a workers' party. And that's also something that attracts interest. So many people reach out to us because we actually hold some opinions about that, whereas others apparently do not discuss it as much. I feel like I'm going to run out of time. I'm going to cut some of my points here. The point I want to illustrate with the report is that many on the outside and small sects of leftists in the US dismiss the DSA, right? Take for granted the narrow national statements and positions taken by the national leadership are reflective of the entire spectrum of thinking inside of the org. And thereby they write off not only the communists inside who are active, but also the opportunity to speak to currently the widest available audience about what it really means to be a socialist, right? People who are just coming to socialist ideas and conclusions are being told by caucuses like Bread and Roses, pro-Sanders people, that socialism is just loving Bernie Sanders, right? But this is a wide open opportunity for those of us who subscribe to left ideas to intervene, to engage these people, especially when the inevitable drift of reformist politics disappoints them. So I'm going to, oh, thank you very much, Simons, I appreciate it. So the reason I'm speaking to you and freely with this information is because I genuinely do not believe in sectarianism. I'm against it. I believe the DSA is like a large connective tissue for the broad left of the US, right? But I will say personally, this is my personal opinion. Thanks for the point. That if you are a leftist in the US today, you haven't joined a DSA chapter, you're missing being able to communicate with a wide array of viewpoints inside this organization, right? If you join DSA, it's not a centralist organization. You can do whatever the hell you want. You're under no obligations except to pay your monthly membership. You can hold educationals on documents written by Ho Chi Minh, right? You could build a reading group on wage, labor, and capital. You could join one that's already happening because there's lots of them. But if we are to achieve revolution, we must engage with each other, right? We must engage in support work across groups, be willing to engage with people who disagree with us, and form relationships. Because if our ideas are correct, then let's engage with people and let's prove the correctness of our ideas in practice. That is how we recruit. That is how we build a socialist movement. DSA is an organization in transition. And again, this is my opinion as well. These tensions between reformism and people who believe in revolution have to change. They can and will change. They might result in a split. They could result in further radicalization of the entire organization. We don't know yet, but we have to differentiate between empiricism, making conclusions based on visible data and outcomes, right? And dialectical reasoning, right? Which is understanding what causes those outcomes, the tension between the opposites inside of this organization, because it's going to force evolutionary change. Unforeseen events are going to take place just like they have this year. And so therefore we have to look at the situation as all political situations, not as static, but focus on the dynamics at play so that we may make predictions about the future, because that's what good leadership does. It makes predictions. So again, I just want to wrap up. Thank the CPI, Center for Political Innovation, for inviting me very much. I want to personally thank Jason Sorna for inviting me on today, and plug two things. I'm hosting a labor event tomorrow. It's a public webinar. It's open, called Labor Rights and the Struggle in Mexico. We've got a couple of journalists as well as labor leadership from the Electrical Workers Union in Mexico speaking with us tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. East Coast time. If it's possible, I can post a link. I'm also selling Maupin's copy of the Green Book, so I could also post my email there if anybody's interested in Muammar Gaddafi's Green Book, a copy of it. I can mail it to people. That's not a problem at all. So I can post my email as well. And again, would like to wrap up. Thank you all very much.
Right on. Thank you, Mee Hall. Sorry about the mix up on that introduction.
You're right.
DSA.
Happens a lot. That's okay.
All right, that was quick, and thank you for that speech. Yeah, damn, Democrats trying to take over everything. You got to get, as Caleb Maupin would say, from the movement to the masses. Communists build power from the masses of people, from our neighbors, and organizing common folks. Next up, we get the agenda here. We have remarks and a cultural performance from Jacob Maxey. Jacob Maxey is a accountant, activist, Marxist anti-imperialist from Louisiana. All right, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Dust. First of all, huge shout out to you. I think you're doing a great job, and I really enjoy Dust James, Anti-Imperialist America. I would really recommend people go check that out if they haven't already. And then, of course, also to all the incredible socialists and Marxists who helped put this together. A lot of work went into it, and I'm very honored to be included amongst both the panel of guests and on Caleb's channel, where I know the community pretty well. So for my presentation, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself because I feel like there's probably a lot of people who come from a similar background and are in a similar situation as me. I'm going to talk about what I'm doing, and I'm going to do my cultural performance. So to start out with a little bit of backstory, I'm 24, living in Louisiana. I'm like right on the cutoff between Gen Z and millennial. I'm like tail end of millennial, beginning of Gen Z. And for people in kind of my age range, I think one of the most important really political moments for most of us, or at least for a lot of us who call ourselves socialists and are around my age, was the Bernie Sanders campaign, right? It was, for a lot of us, it was the first time that we felt like a major political candidate was taking what we needed into account. And I wasn't an activist until like probably a month or two ago. And I'm not particularly active in any party just because in Lafayette, there's not a large socialist organization. And so the Bernie movement kind of represented people like me, people who weren't part of a massive party, but kind of believed in these ideas. And then we all kind of saw as Bernie was disallowed from the club, right? He just wasn't allowed to make his case. And obviously they didn't treat him very fairly. And it became kind of apparent to a lot of us that what we call liberal democracy actually may not be very interested in representing our interests. And also around that time, I'm sure people remember, but Bernie Sanders was getting called a communist, right? Bernie's a commie. Bernie's a socialist. He met Fidel, whatever. And at the time, I was not in 2016, I was just a Bernie guy. I wasn't a socialist or I wasn't a communist, but everybody called Bernie a communist. So I was like, well, I need to find out what communism actually is. And like a lot of people who are trying to figure out what communism actually is, I went out and bought a copy of the Communist Manifesto, which probably actually is not the best book to buy because I would go on to spend about 2 years totally misunderstanding what was in that book and what Marx was talking about. But regardless, damage was done. I was a socialist. In 2016, I was calling myself a socialist. And I graduated with a degree in accounting, which was really great because it basically allowed me to do two things. Number one, now that I've gone back to get my master's and I'm a Marxist and I understand Marxism, I can apply Marxism and class analysis to the academic study of accounting, which in the English language is not done very often. It kind of helps me stand out. I'm sure there's a Chinese Marxist theory of accounting, a Vietnamese Marxist theory of accounting, but it doesn't really exist in English. And that's a point I want to make just real quick, which is that if you are in school and you're doing academics like me, I would really recommend that you put all your effort into figuring out how Marxism applies to your academic discipline, because in my experience, my professors are kind of amazed and they really kind of like that I come at it with a different perspective and that I'm really critically thinking about this stuff. And probably, to be honest, most of them have never heard of Marxism. The first time they've really heard of Marxism and thought of it as applied to accounting or really anything was whenever I submit my papers to them. But the other thing that becoming an accountant allowed me to do is the thing that accounting kind of allows you to do best, which is to have a stable life, right? I can pay my rent. And it also allowed me to have enough money left over to start investing in these leftist kind of projects that I really believed in, these anti-imperialist Marxist projects. And that was my plan for a long time. I was like, well, I'm just going to be an accountant, middle of the road kind of guy. I'm not an activist. I'm just going to give money to some of these projects whenever I can. And that was kind of my plan. And around 2018, I was working as an accountant in Dallas. And for the first time, I started to really understand Marxism. I'd been kind of calling myself a Marxist for 2 years, but it was really just more meme communism. It wasn't real Marxism and socialism, not ideology. And I really began to understand it in 2018 when I watched a video in my YouTube recommended called "They Are Keeping the World Poor, Understanding Global Conflicts," which is a video Caleb Maupin put out. And basically in this video, Caleb lays out in very simple terms the Leninist understanding of imperialism. And this was probably a year, maybe year and a half before I ever tried to read Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And it was at that moment that I began to actually understand Leninism and Marxism and imperialism. And it didn't require me to, bang my head against the wall trying to understand a 200-year-old Marxist text. It didn't require me to go out and be an activist. It was just, I could understand the theory. What Caleb provided me was an opportunity to really understand what this stuff meant. And so I went through like Caleb's entire video library. I was like, I can't believe how easy and how interesting this stuff can be. And in the end, I ended up buying his book, his latest book at the time, which was Getting Rich Without Capitalism, America's Way Out. And that book blew my mind because it just took these Marxist concepts of economics, really complex stuff. I mean, Marx wrote 2 volumes of Capital and then worked on 3 volumes. And Caleb took it and he made it easy for me to understand, right? And I didn't know it at the time, but that was the beginning of my current project. The fact that I now understood this stuff and I knew that if other people read this, they could understand it too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm doing right now. What I'm doing, and I'm going to start with saying that if you're on left Twitter, if you're on left book, you're probably familiar with this phenomenon. There are a lot of ideas constantly floated around in left social media. Some of them are pretty cool. Some of them are really good and some of them are pretty bad. But there's not a ton of Marxist ideology. There's not a ton of discussion of Marxist ideology in these circles. And if you listen to Caleb's streams, you'll probably know that this can be chalked up to a lot of things. It could be McCarthyism, COINTELPRO, the manipulation of left-wing politics by the American and European bourgeoisie. But either way, I think a lot of us have become convinced that what's really lacking in a lot of ways among popular discourse is Marxist ideology. It's just not out there. At least it's not out there to the extent that it should be. And that was kind of a turning point for me. And I realized that I couldn't just sit back and sit on the sidelines and let other people do the work while I worked as an accountant and gave what money I could. I had to actually get started and actually try to do something. And it was around that time that Caleb was talking about building the Center for Political Innovation, a think tank. And I became really, really excited when he started to talk about that. I knew it was something that I wanted to be a part of. And I knew it was something that I wanted the opportunity to help build and to make great. And so probably about a month and a half ago, I messaged Caleb. And let me say, I think the first time I messaged Caleb was 2018 in Dallas. He was great. I don't even remember what we talked about, but he was great. And he talked about Marxism with me. But I messaged Caleb about a month and a half ago. And I got an estimate on 40 copies of Getting Rich Without Capitalism, America's Way Out at print cost. And I knew that I wanted to distribute these books. And so I started doing my research. I reached out to my university. I did research on like COVID restrictions. I did research on free speech issues on campus. And I ended up coming up with the idea to just set up a table on campus with a big sign that says, "Ask me about socialism," with a box of books, and to let people come and talk to me about socialism. I'll talk to them. I'll hand out books to people who are interested. And it's taken a lot of work. I had some setbacks because we had like 3 hurricanes and like a month here in Louisiana. We've been getting it rough, but finally, I'm pretty much on track to, for the first time, set up my table on Friday, this next Friday, where I will be handing out books with Caleb's work, Caleb's ideas, and these Marxist, these simple and easy explanations of complex Marxist theory. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that if you're like me and you don't really consider yourself an activist, maybe you're not even particularly outgoing, and you're not part of a formal party either because there's no infrastructure where you're at, or just because there's no party that you feel really represents what you think. I think this is something that should work for you, because this is something you can do yourself, right? If you're in Caleb's community, or you're watching this and you're thinking, what can I actually do to help get this ideology out there? Well, these kind of things are things you can do yourself. You set up a table, and you just talk to people. You get out there in your community and you talk to people. Like Dust says, like Caleb always says, out of the movement into the masses. Get out there and talk to people. And I want to emphasize that I did a lot of research. It took some time. It wasn't. It didn't come together like that. But I'm really excited to start working on it. And so, if you're like me and you're an optimist and you're a socialist, and you really do believe that we can build socialism in this country, like I really do believe, and you really agree that we need to get this ideology out there, we need to get people talking about Marxism. We need to get people to understand Marxism. This is something you can do. It can be a school. It could be downtown. It could be a public park. Wherever it's legal for you to set up and hand out books, it's something you could do. And I want to end by saying, if you are familiar with Caleb's channel, you may know this story. And it's the story. It's about William Z. Foster. And this is kind of partially what inspired me. William Z. Foster, who's one of the greatest American socialists, one of the greatest American Marxist thinkers in U.S. history. He started calling himself a socialist at the age of 19 because he was walking on his way to work, and there was some guy, some socialist, sitting on the street corner talking about socialism with people. And we don't know the name of the guy who was talking about socialism on that street corner on that soapbox. We have no idea who it was. But that was a pivotal moment in the history of this country. This one weird little thing. This guy got up that morning, decided he was going to go talk about socialism on the street corner. And because of that, we got William Z. Foster. We got the strength of the Communist Party in the early 20th century, really a butterfly effect. And that's kind of what's at stake. That's kind of what I figured what's at stake here is, who could we be reaching today who could be the revolutionary leader of tomorrow, right? Without getting the ideology out there, we're doing ourselves a massive disservice. And that's kind of what I've come here to talk about. And I'll end by saying I hope that there's someone out there who's listening with an even better idea than mine, who's going to totally blow my idea out of the water, and that you'll share it with me, and then we'll do your idea. And that would be awesome. Let's build socialist ideology, and let's build socialist community. And then I don't really have a shout out. I don't have any work that I'm looking at publishing right now, or, I don't have a YouTube channel right now. I will say that I know there are people who watch Caleb streams who are located in Lafayette, who are in New Orleans, who are in Baton Rouge, Houston, Shreveport. I have a good friend in Shreveport who watches these. Reach out to me if you're interested in getting together and talking and working on this stuff. I would really like to get to know you, and we can work together, and that would be great. And so as a final note, I adapted a version of Peter Seeger's 1930 song, If I Had a Hammer, the Hammer song. He originally sang it for the Communist Party in the 1930s, back when the Communist Party was experiencing some serious legal issues. And he sang it in solidarity with them. So I've kind of come together and adapted my own version of the song. I hope you all like it. I know I'm dressed in a suit. I am not trying to be early 1960s Beatles. I did not have time to change between my presentation and my song. But here we go. We got a hammer in the morning, hammer in the evening, all over this world. Yeah. Hammer out danger, hammer out a warning, hammer out justice for a fellow man. Yeah. Fire out a bell, ring it in the morning, ring it in the evening, all over this land. Yeah. Ring out a bell, ring out a danger, ring out a warning. Well, we got a hammer and we got a bell, and we got a message to the world to tell. If we got a song, sing it in the morning, sing it in the evening, all over this land. Yeah. Sing out in danger, sing out a warning, sing out love for a fellow man. Yeah. Well, we got a hammer and we got a bell, and we got a message that we need to tell. So brothers and sisters, the future is in our hands. The hammer and bell will sing for a better land, for a better land. Sing for a better land. Yeah. Sing for a better land. Awesome. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacob, Max. That was beautiful. I guess I'm about to introduce our keynote speaker, Caleb Maupin. Just want to thank everyone who came on. After this, we're going to have Caleb Maupin speak, and he's going to take over as MC. And then we're going to go into a discussion. Questions you can ask. You can ask Caleb. You can ask anybody questions in the YouTube chat. We got some prepared. Just a big thank you for everyone that came on. Inspiring work throughout the country. Interesting group of folks we've assembled here tonight. So I guess I'll introduce Caleb Maupin. I've been doing anti-war immigrants. I've been in the movement for a long time, and I remember Caleb way back in the day when he was with I won't mention who, but I remember this real long-haired and long beard and fiery voice. I think it was a live where he went into Walmart screaming about something, and I was like, oh my God, that dude's on fire. He's awesome. And then I ended up burning out, getting out of the activist movement. I ended up driving tractor trailer, and I kept up with him on the Facebook. Next thing I know, he's doing these lives. Like he goes an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, just sticks to Marxism, doesn't give into the bullshit, doesn't sound pretentious, gets in the clean, say what needs to be done and teach folks who don't understand. Recently when he was doing one of his lives, he said I gave him the best compliment he ever heard, and that's I said he writes and speaks like William Z. Foster, which is clean, to the point, doesn't need to sound like he's making himself smart. Just trying to actually achieve socialism, work with whoever needs to work for it, to build workers' power and fight for socialism. So next up, Caleb Maupin. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Well, this has been such an amazing program so far. Music, speeches and presentations, people from all over the country. So I think, you know, we've been at this for a little while now. So before I get into my remarks, I think we should all, you know, just take a minute to stretch, you know, just stretch out, maybe get a drink of water, you know, make sure that, you're not feeling stir crazy, because we've all been sitting here in front of our computers or with our phones or whatever for a while. So just stretch, just relax. I've got plenty of unnamed diet beverage here, as always. I usually don't want to drink unnamed diet beverage this late in the evening, but it's a special occasion, I think. So I think it'll be all right. Yeah, look, folks, you know, the last few months, I can be sure that all of us have had moments where we just wanted to stick our head out of the window and scream at the top of our lungs, right? This pandemic has been absolutely insane. And the political situation in this country that's developing right now has been absolutely insane. And if you are somebody who is conscious of politics in the way that all of us are, if you're somebody that's part of a community like the community that we're building, if you're somebody who understands the way the universe works, your head just wants to explode. I mean, you must just be like, what is going to happen next? How can we continue this way? I mean, there must be parts of you that just want to blow up. So I want everyone to just take a deep breath, breathe in, breathe out. You know, we're here. You're among friends. You're among comrades. You're among brothers and sisters. And we're going to, for the next little bit, just kind of engage about what this project, the Center for Political Innovation, is, and how it could have an impact amid this ongoing crisis of capitalism. So forget about all the fears you may have for the moment. Forget about paying your bills. Forget about any tension you might have with a relative or a romantic partner or somebody in your life. Put your worries about your job aside. Put your worries about the future aside. Put your anxiety about this upcoming election and the turmoil in the country. Put all of that aside for just a few minutes and let's engage. Let's have a conversation. Now, folks, I really want to give a special shout out, right? Because, you know, I have organized with people of all different ages in the past. You know, I learned Marxism from somebody who was way older than a baby boomer, somebody who could remember the 1930s. But I spent a lot of time with a lot of baby boomer activists who could remember the 1960s and 70s. But I know that there are a number of us that are watching that are either millennials or Generation Z. And this pandemic, I must say, must be particularly stressful for people who are under the age of 18. Because I can tell you that when I was 17, 16, 15, 14, there was nothing I hated more than just sitting around the house and being bored out of my mind. And there's been a lot of that going on for younger working class people in the last few months. And my heart just absolutely goes out to them. I don't know how you're holding your sanity right now, because I would just be losing my mind if I were stuck in my parents' household at that age amid the pandemic. It would be a moment of great anxiety and frustration for me. When I was young, growing up in a small town in Ohio, one thing that I did to kind of find solace and pass the time is I would study the Little Red Book. This is Mao Zedong's Little Red Book. And this is actually the Little Red Book that I bought when I was 14 years old. I remember, I didn't have a credit card. I was 14. So I put $10 together and I actually went to the post office and got a money order. And I sent the money order to a communist bookstore in Cleveland. And then about 10 days later, they sent me this Little Red Book, the one I'm holding in my hand. They sent it to me in the mail. And it's funny because when you move a lot, which I have moved a lot, and I've been in New York City for a while, and you move from one apartment to another. When you move, you always lose books. But I have not lost this particular book, this Little Red Book, this actual little red book that I bought when I was 15. And so, I was looking through it, and there's a section of the little red book towards the end where it's the chapter about the youth. And I just wanted to read a passage from it. He talks about the youth towards the end of the book. He says, young people are the most active and vital force in society. They are the most eager to learn and the least conservative in their thinking. This is especially so in the era of socialism, but that's not the important part. The part that I wanted to read is this. Mao Zedong says, how shall we judge whether a youth is revolutionary? How can we tell? There can be only one criteria, namely, whether or not he is willing to integrate himself with the broad masses of workers and peasants and does so. If he is willing to do so and actually does so, he is a revolutionary. Now I'm going to read it one more time. How should we judge whether or not a youth is a revolutionary? How can we tell? There can only be one criterion, namely, whether or not he is willing to integrate himself with the broad masses of workers and peasants and does so in practice. If he is willing to do so and actually does so, he is a revolutionary. Now, when I first read those words years ago, I did not really know what they meant. And I don't really think I really started to understand those words for maybe another 10 years, maybe another 12 years, right? I think that your understanding and your depth with these kind of concepts, you might think you understand something the first time you read it, but then you look back 5 years later and you say, wow, I really didn't understand it. And then you read it in another 5 years, and then you say, wow, I really didn't understand it. I tell people that I first started to understand Marxism, to really understand the Marxist dialectical materialist method of analyzing the world during the financial crisis and the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when I studied William Z. Foster's book on the history of the three internationals. And in that book, he talked about the role of Karl Marx in the American Civil War. Lincoln was not a communist. The Union Army was not going to create socialism. But Karl Marx understood that the struggle to abolish slavery was a progressive struggle, and that if Marxists were going to have an impact, they had to embed themselves with the abolitionists and with Harriet Tubman and with the Union Army. And William Z. Foster talks about the fact that leaders of the Communist International, even though there was so few of them in the United States, were involved in this struggle to abolish slavery. He talked about August Willich and Joseph Wedemeyer, right? And that level of depth was very important to understand. And in that book, you learn about the polemics between Marx and the anarchists, figures like Mikhail Bakunin, figures like Joseph Proudhon, who had a very different understanding of how the world worked than Marx. And while they both shared the same goal of building a stateless and classless world, they had a very different understanding of the methods and how to get there. Now, some of the best advice I ever received was that if you're a Marxist, never say anything that you do not know. However, if you do know something and you know it in your soul, you absolutely know it to be true, never be afraid to say it. So never say anything that you do not know. But if you do know something and you really know it, don't be afraid to say it as loud as you can. Now, I've actually used that bit of advice in many different fields of life. But, for example, around 9/11, I don't know that the US government, was involved in 9/11. So I don't say that. I don't know that there was some kind of wider conspiracy. So I don't say that. I don't say things that I do not know. However, I do know that there are some things about the official story of 9/11 that don't exactly add up. So I am not afraid to say that. And I am not ashamed to say, now that we have the 28 pages, from Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of things about what we were told about 9/11 that don't add up. I know that, so I can say it. I don't say what I don't know. I only say what I do know, right? This is an important understanding. And it's a very valuable way of understanding things. I don't know who is going to win the upcoming presidential election. I don't know at this point, I do not know how soon the big economic fallout that is coming as a result of the pandemic and the capitalist crisis and the low-wage police state. I don't know when that big fallout is coming. But what I do know is that the US government and the US ruling class have committed themselves to economic policies and economic decisions that are digging their own graves, and that we are heading toward a bigger crisis. I've talked before about how, in a lot of ways, the United States, since the end of the Second World War, has been adopting what you could call Nazi economics. Now, it sounds like a hyperbolic term, right? That sounds, a little extreme. But if you understand fascism and you understand Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime in Germany, there was a certain economic approach that they applied in order to carry out and effectively rule Germany and lead to the great catastrophe known as the Second World War, to commit the horrendous mass murder known as the Holocaust. There was a certain economic philosophy that the Nazis preached, and it came from Halmer Schacht. One of the best books I ever read on the history of Nazi Germany was called Hitler's Banker, and it was a biography. It wasn't about Goebbels. It wasn't about various figures that are associated with it. It wasn't even really about Hitler. It was about Halmer Schacht, Hitler's banker. He was the economist of Nazi Germany, right? In the 1920s, Germany was having a capitalist crisis, just like every other Western country was at that point, the Great Depression. And so there was a feeling that the government needed to take action on some level to stabilize the economy, right? There was fear in Germany that the massive Communist Party might take power, might build socialism in Germany, there might be a revolution. There was fear that continuing instability might spill over into the rest of Europe. There was a feeling that they needed to do something. The capitalist class needed to do something in order to stabilize the economy. And so, it was decided by the Nazis when they took power that the government was going to spend a lot of money in order to stabilize the economy. But the question was, what would they spend the money on? And the Nazi state made the decision to spend the money on two things: prisons and military production, right? The Nazis took power. They outlawed the Communist Party. They outlawed the Social Democratic Party. They rounded up all the people that were leaders of the Communist Party, all the people that were leaders of the Social Democratic Party, and they put them in concentration camps. And they spent a lot of money to build these concentration camps. And they gave a lot of jobs to a lot of people to be guards in these concentration camps. And so all the people that were in the concentration camps were no longer unemployed and looking for a job because they were in a concentration camp. And all the people that were hired to build these concentration camps were no longer unemployed. They were, setting up concentration camps. And all these people that worked as guards in these concentration camps, they were no longer unemployed. They were working as guards in the concentration camps. And so you drastically reduced unemployment. And the Nazi state also decided that they were going to pull out of the Treaty of Versailles. They were going to start rebuilding Germany's military and rebuilding the weapons of war and the implements of destruction, rebuilding an air force, rebuilding guns and tanks and planes. And so, of course, many people that were previously unemployed got jobs building military equipment, were hired and worked in the so-called defense industry, or they from there, maybe they ended up joining the German military they started building. So the way the German fascist state was able to stabilize the economy of Germany in the 1930s was by investing in destruction, right? They said, we are going to stabilize the economy of Germany. We are going to rebuild the German economy from the capitalist crisis by putting huge sections of the population in prisons and building a huge prison apparatus and building a huge military apparatus. In essence, the economic basis of Nazism was that you can stimulate and stabilize a capitalist economy through destruction. Prisons are institutions of destruction. Military spending, war, tanks, those are, bombs. These things are implements of destruction. And Nazi economics is how they were able to create a temporary economic boom in Germany that ultimately only lasted maybe 4 or 5, 6 years at the most. And by 1939, Europe was heading off to the Second World War, one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. And that after the Second World War in the United States, many people observed that in the United States, we saw the rise of something called the military-industrial complex. In fact, US President Eisenhower even warned about the danger of a military-industrial complex, because it seemed like the way the US capitalist economy was continuing to move ahead was by doing the same thing that the Nazis had done, by spending lots of money on the military, right? That the military spending, military manufacturing became so essential to the US economy that it was almost impossible for a president to stop the country from going to war, because war was what the US economy was all about. Now, unlike Nazi Germany, they didn't create it really fast. It wasn't created in like 1 year. It was a gradual process throughout the 1950s and up into the 60s, building a whole economy centered around a military industrial complex. And then we know in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, after the political upsurge of the 1960s, after there was starting to be the process of deindustrialization in the United States, as living standards were starting to go down, as after the post-war economic expansion came to an end, we saw the creation gradually, again, not immediately like the Nazis did, but gradually, of a prison industrial complex, right? Of a system of prisons for profit, where economies were stimulated, people were hired, the workforce was cleared of unemployed workers by locking people in jail. And all across the United States, we saw the rate of incarceration rising as an economic stimulus. So since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been committed to Nazi economics. That the US leaders have decided that the way that they're going to stabilize the capitalist economy, the naturally unstable economy of profits in command, the way that they're going to stabilize it is by using the Nazi method, by using methods of destruction, building up tanks and bombs and guns, engaging in confrontations and big wars around the world, beating down countries around the world with war, and impoverishing and destroying the lives of their population, and turning human beings into a way to make profits through building up a low-wage police state. The ruling class of the United States has tried to stabilize capitalism with Nazi economics. And just like in Nazi Germany, it only worked for 5 or 6 years, and then World War II happened because their economy was about to fall apart. Just like in the United States, 2008, 2009, the economy came crashing down, right? The housing bubble burst, right? People say, what happened? What happened with the housing bubble burst? Why did this happen? Well, it happened because the living standards of average Americans were going down. Americans, they just didn't have the ability to buy cars and TV sets and houses like they once did. And, in the Federal Reserve, there was a panic going on. They were panicking because Americans just couldn't spend money like they once did. I don't know if folks remember. I remember that after 9/11, George W. Bush, who was the president of the United States, he was asked, what can Americans do if they want to help in the aftermath of 9/11? And George W. Bush said, if you want to defeat Al-Qaeda, you got to go shopping. Go shopping. That's how you can defeat the terrorists. And it was the dumbest thing. And people are like, go shopping? What is he talking about? But what George W. Bush was talking about, why he said that, was because in the back room with Alan Greenspan, the protege of Ayn Rand, the sociopath who did not believe in altruism and compassion, the protege of Ayn Rand, Alan Greenspan, was telling George W. Bush, you got to get them to spend money. The economy is going to crash if you don't get them to spend money. They were panicking inside the Federal Reserve because Americans weren't spending money. Why were Americans not spending money? Because our wages have been going down for a few decades. Because we have record rates of student debt and household debt. Because our neighborhoods don't even have paved roads in some cases. They're unpaving the roads throughout the United States. Why were Americans not spending money? When you drive the wages of Americans down, when you drive the wages of working people down, their ability to spend decreases. The working class is also the consumers. And if you drive the living standards and the wages of working people down, pretty soon they can't buy back all the products that they are producing. And you have a classic crisis of overproduction. So Alan Greenspan was there in the Federal Reserve. He was whispering in the ear of George W. Bush and telling him to tell Americans to keep spending. What also happened was there was a huge deregulation of the lending of money, and all kinds of easy credit, lending practices, were legalized because there was a desperation to keep Americans spending. And, the mortgage crisis was based on the fact that eventually, after so many, predatory mortgage housing loans had been spent, pretty soon the country was glutted with houses that could not be sold. Pretty soon you had, homes all over the United States being foreclosed. And you actually got a situation in 2008, 2009, where in Nevada, outside of Las Vegas, there was a tent city that was erected. All these families that had their homes foreclosed and were homeless were living in tents outside of the city of Las Vegas in Nevada. And they're living in tents, right? And what was going on there was you had a situation where thousands of Americans were homeless because there were too many houses, right? That was the 2008 financial collapse, a situation where people were homeless all across the United States, not because there was a shortage of housing, but because there were too many houses. This is the irrationality of capitalism. Only under capitalism can people be homeless because there are too many houses. Only under capitalism can people be hungry and starve because there's too much food. This is the irrationality of a system of profits in command. And this is the crisis that we are facing here in the United States. Now, another good bit of advice that I got, the person told me never to say anything that I do not know, but if I do know something, to never be afraid to say it. The same person also gave me the advice. They said, it wasn't really advice, it was just a fact. But sometimes you have to choose. Sometimes in life, you reach a moment where you have to choose. You have to make a decision. And I remember the summer that Barack Obama was elected, I actually had an internship. I was working with communist activists in Detroit to work against home foreclosures. We were trying to get a bill passed to stop home foreclosures in the state of Michigan, to declare a moratorium on home foreclosures. And I was staffing the office. There's a Methodist church that's in downtown Detroit, right next to the stadium. And I worked in that office, and we were trying our hardest to get this bill passed that would stop home foreclosures in the state of Michigan. And I remember one day our phone rang, and there was a woman on the phone, a woman of color, and she was sobbing. And she said, we're getting foreclosed. I mean, we're getting kicked out of our house. And she was panicking. She didn't know what was going on. So, down the hall from the office where I was working on, there was the Detroit Welfare Rights Union, which was a group that worked with low-income people. We got her on the phone. We said, what happened? Well, she didn't own her home. She rented her home. She had 2 children. She rented her home, and she'd been paying her rent just like she was supposed to, paying her rent to her landlord. Her landlord had not told her that the bank was foreclosing on the house she was living in. So this whole time she's paying her rent just like she's supposed to. The landlord's coming and taking the check, never telling her that on a certain date, the bank is going to come and clear the property and kick people out. And so this woman had no idea that her housing situation was in danger, no idea that anything was going on. She had just been paying her rent like normal. And suddenly one morning, she's getting ready to go to work, and there's the sheriff knocking on her door saying, you got to be out because we're gonna, this house is foreclosed. The landlord, is being foreclosed on. So she's panicking. So of course we get in our car, we go over there, folks from the Welfare Rights Union, folks from the moratorium campaign. We're standing there at the house, and there's the sheriff there, and he's like, I hate this. This is my job, but this building is foreclosed. The bank is foreclosing. You got to get out of here. And she's crying, and she's saying, I've got 2 kids here. I've been paying my rent. This isn't right. And so there was a moment there, right, where communist activists were standing there. What are we going to do, right? And the sheriff is saying, we gotta move. You got to get your stuff out. And so we had a moment there. And I looked at the older guy. It was a guy named Alan, an older middle-aged guy, former auto worker who would have these long layoffs. And so he would do volunteer activist work. I looked at the woman from the Welfare Rights Union, and we all had the exact same thought in that moment. It's one of those moments where you have to choose. with the sheriff standing there, and all of us walked up to the porch, and we sat down on the porch, sending the message that, hey, you're going to move in on this woman. You're going to have to deal with us. And that was the moment. Now, what then happened? The sheriff looks there. He's one sheriff. He says, well, I'm coming back. He says, I'm coming back in a few hours. So we were able to get a progressive judge who was an ally of the progressive movement in Detroit on the phone. That progressive judge was able to issue an injunction, and we stopped this woman from being kicked out of her home, right? We actually stopped it. And it was a victorious moment, and it felt really good. And later that summer, we were involved in a struggle. There was a woman who had a predatory loan. Her name was Ruby Curl Pinkins, and she got her whole church out there. And it was a progressive struggle. We stopped this home foreclosure. It was a victory. It was a big moment. And it was community struggles like that. And at that moment, you know, when those community struggles were going on, when I was studying Marxism, I was studying Lenin, I was studying Marxist theory, but I was also, you know, involved in these struggles, that I started to maybe have a little bit more of an understanding of what Mao said in the Little Red Book when he said, how should we judge whether or not a youth is revolutionary? How can you tell? There can only be one criteria, namely whether or not he's willing to integrate himself with the broad masses of workers and peasants and does so in practice. If he is willing to do so and actually does so, he is a revolutionary. Now, there were other moments, though, where I was forced to think of Mao's words. There were other moments where I started to have a deeper understanding. You know, I have heard my whole life, and I'm sure you've heard your whole life too, that communism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried. Never has any society in history ever been successful with a socialist government. Just completely failed. This is repeated throughout the country of the United States as fact. Right? It is undisputed fact. Everywhere socialism has ever been implemented, it has been complete and an utter complete failure. It's never worked. It fails everywhere it's ever been tried. Well, no, I don't know exactly what every detail was about the Soviet Union and whether or not every allegation against the Soviet Union is true or false. I don't know exactly if every allegation they make against Mao is explicitly true or explicitly false. I don't know. I don't know in detail everything that went on in the history of the 20th century and Marxist-Leninist governments. I know there's a lot of lies and blatant lies that are told about socialist countries. I also know that there's a lot of mistakes that have been made, so I don't know the specifics. But what I do know is that this notion that socialism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried is so utterly ridiculous. It's laughable. In 1917, Russia was an agrarian, impoverished society. By the 1930s, it was an industrial powerhouse. It had electrified the country. It was producing more steel than any other country in the world. It had some of the largest hydroelectrical power plants in the world. By the 1960s, even after a horrendous world war that killed 26 million people, they rebuilt and they were fully industrialized, and they were helping countries like Egypt and Syria and other countries around the world to industrialize and build up millions of people raised out of poverty, healthcare for the population, universal employment, wiping out illiteracy. There is no way you can say that the Soviet Union was an economic failure. The Soviet Union had problems, but it was an economic success if there ever has been. A whole country was rapidly raised up from poverty and transformed. And the same thing is true for China. You know, China used to be called the sick man of Asia. Right? They used to talk about China as a country where people died all the time from famines. There would be famines all the time because they didn't have a strong central government, because they didn't have their own industries, because the fields in China that should have been growing crops to feed people were instead growing opium poppies because the British had forced the opium trade onto them. So all over the world, China was known as being one of the poorest countries in the world. And now we look at China today, it is the second largest economy in the world. And it is the Chinese Communist Party and their leadership that has raised China up from poverty and made it into a global superpower. China, at this point, has a largely state-run economy. I always laugh. It's very funny. You know, people who think that Obamacare is communism, if you point out China's economic successes, will always insist China is capitalist. Well, I mean, Obamacare, there's no government health care, no public option. Somehow that's communism. But China, with state-run banks, state-run industries, 5-year economic plans, a ruling communist party. Somehow China, it must be capitalist. Well, China is not capitalist. Capitalism is a system in which the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital, meaning that production is only carried out so that those who own the major centers of economic power can make profits. In China, there is a state central plan that guides production, and even the private sector is not operating simply according to what's profitable. Even the private sector is closely regulated and controlled by the state. The Chinese Communist Party, which is based in communities, which has over 90 million members, is actively guiding the economy. And they have made mistakes, and they have problems with corruption and other things. But there is no question in my mind that just as the Soviet Union was a socialist society, China today is a socialist society. And it's not only China that has had economic successes with socialism. You look at Libya. Prior to the 2011 war, Libya was the most prosperous country on the African continent. I mean, it was the country on the African continent that provided healthcare to its population, that provided universal employment. They built the largest irrigation system in the world, the Great Man-Made River. Prior to 2011, people from all over Africa were actually trying to get into Libya. In fact, that was one of the main grievances during the revolution, was that a lot of these wealthy people who didn't like Gaddafi were complaining about the fact there were so many dark-skinned guest workers from all over the African continent who would come to Libya. Prior to 2011, when Libya was a socialist country, people from all over Africa were trying to get in to Libya because they wanted the benefits of what socialism had created, what the Islamic socialist system of Gaddafi had created. But now that Libya has been forced to join the global free market system, the global capitalist system, the system of profits and command with NATO bombs, now that the Great Man-Made River, the largest irrigation system in the world that socialism constructed, has been bombed to pieces, now that the World Bank and the IMF and the United Nations have got their foothold into Libya, now that the imperialists have sunk their fangs into Libya, things have gotten so bad that people are trying to get out, right? That people die drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out of Libya. Under socialism, people were trying to get into Libya. Under capitalism, people are risking their lives and dying trying to get out of Libya. And they want to tell us that capitalism is the answer, that the free market system is the answer, that their next regime change operation is the answer. I think we can look at the situation in Libya and make a decision for ourselves. Now, I think I want to get to things that you haven't all heard before. And forgive me, I know a lot of you watch these broadcasts, so you've heard all of this before many times. But I want to get to the essence of this broadcast, because this is the first web conference that we've had for the Center for Political Innovation. And, people have asked, why are you doing this, Caleb? Why are you creating the Center for Political Innovation? Why don't you create a new communist party? Why don't you start a newspaper and go out and sell your newspaper everywhere? And why don't you get a permit and have a cage and have some protests? Why don't you try to, run an election campaign where you're on the ballot in one state? Why don't you do what communists have been doing in the United States for the last 100 years with so little success? Well, because it's not working. And I think what we need to understand here, what we really need to understand here, is that every successful movement towards socialism that I have ever seen has begun with a big change in how the socialist movement operates, right? Take the Russian Revolution, for example. Russian Revolution, you had a Marxist party in Russia, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and they engaged in bowing to spontaneity. Whenever there was an uprising or a strike among the population, they would go and support it and hand out their leaflets and explain that capitalism was the problem, and they would just tail after whatever the masses did. Whenever there was an uprising among the peasants, they would run after it and say, "Wow, we Marxists, we support it." And they had a bunch of different newspapers, and just basically whenever there was some kind of spontaneous rebellion in Russia, the Marxists would show up and say they supported it, and it was here. They would go there, they would run there, they would run there, whatever was happening in general, they would just run after it. They call it tailism. But Lenin had the idea that instead of engaging in tailism, instead of bowing to spontaneity, that they should develop what he called a party of a new type, and that this party of a new type would operate in a completely different way. It would, practice this theory he developed called democratic centralism, where they all coordinated their activities. It would engage in agitation. It would engage in propaganda. It would agitate to the masses, and it would propagate to the advanced. And it would be one step ahead of the workers. It wouldn't be running behind them, but it would be one step ahead of them, raising progressive demands, raising demands of workers, right? That was the idea. And in 1903, Lenin gathered a group of communists together, and he said to them, hey, I'm going to build this party of a new type. And the majority of the people in the room was in London, the majority of the people in the room said they would go along with it, and they were called the majority. And the people who didn't want to go along with it, they were the minority, they were called the minority. The word for majority in Russian is Bolshevik. The word for minority in Russian is Menshevik. And so the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was divided into two factions. Those who wanted to go along with Lenin's new theory of a party of a new type, they became the Bolsheviks. And those who wanted to stay in the old way, continue doing what the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party had done, continue bowing to spontaneity, they became the Mensheviks. And it was that moment, that shift, that marked the beginning of Russia actually moving towards socialism. If they had just continued to do things in the old way, there would never have been a Russian Revolution, right? And it was that decision that the old way is not working, that we need to develop a new way, we need to apply a new way, and we need to utilize these methods that made the Russian Revolution. And let me add that there's a reason Lenin developed his theory of the party of a new type, because in Russia there's a long tradition of secret society. So, there was the Decembrists, for example, that worked and conspired against Tsar Nicholas I. There was the Old Believers, which was like a religious organization that rejected some of the reforms in the Russian Orthodox Church, and that most of the population of Russia at that time was illiterate. And the idea that you would form some kind of secret society or monastic order among the educated revolutionaries that would engage in agitation and propaganda, looking at the situation in Russia in the 1900s, it made sense. Right? So they decided they had figured out something that made sense for Russia in their time, and they decided to change the way they operated very dramatically in order to apply it, and they did it. And that's where the Russian Revolution came from. You look at the Chinese Revolution, right? The Chinese Communist Party had supported correctly the KMT movement, right? In China, there was this leader named Dr. Sun Yat-sen. He was a progressive and a forward-thinking leader, and he built a mass movement of the nationalist or the KMT movement in China based on three principles: democracy, independence, and the people's livelihood. And that third thing, the people's livelihood, people understood that somehow meant some kind of socialism, but it was unclear. And so this was a broad democratic movement in China to build a modern China, to break China out of the rule of foreign corporations and foreign banks. But it was a broad movement, and the communists joined that movement. But Mao, who was a member of the Chinese Communist Party, and he was an alternate member of the National Committee of the KMT. He carried out that line of joining the KMT movement. Mao was from the countryside, and he wrote a very important document, which I would encourage anyone to read if you want to understand the history of the Chinese Revolution. And it's called Reports from an Investigation of the Peasant Uprisings in Hunan. And Mao, he's been operating in the cities. He's been a communist organizer, building trade unions in the cities, being part of the KMT nationalist movement. He goes to the countryside in Hunan, where there's been this rebellion among the peasants. And he sees the anger of the Chinese peasantry, right? And he says, this is where the revolution is going to come from. It's this anger of peasants who their whole life have been degraded and not allowed to lift up their heads. It's their anger that is going to lead to the overthrow of capitalism and the creation of socialism in China. It is their anger. And he writes this essay in 1926. And if you read the essay, he's burning in anger, not just at the oppression that these peasants suffer, but at the Chinese Communist Party. Because the Chinese Communist Party is ignoring the peasant uprisings that are taking place in Hunan, right? They have the attitude that these peasants, they're illiterate, they're peasants, so they aspire to become capitalists. They own their own property. They're not factory workers. It doesn't fit the formula that the Communist International has given us. So the Chinese Communist Party is ignoring the rebellions among the peasantry. And so Mao writes this essay burning with anger, just burning with anger, because he says, look, he says, when the masses are in motion, you have three choices. You can ignore them, you can follow behind them, gesticulating and criticizing, or you can march to the front and lead them. And every Chinese is free to choose. This is what he writes in his essay, right? And he's angry at the Chinese Communist Party because they're ignoring this huge uprising. That's where the quote, that essay, there's a famous quote that I'm sure you've all heard before. He says, a single spark can light a prairie fire, right? And Mao is urging the Chinese Communist Party to turn around, to change the direction it's moving in order to make a revolution. That if they're going to have socialism in China, they can't just copy what the Bolsheviks did in Russia. They need to develop a formula. They need to develop a method that specifically applies to China in their time. And they need to go to the peasantry, the real powder keg. And that's where the revolution is going to come to. Mao has that understanding. And eventually, Mao fights against many different factions, and he eventually develops the strategy of going to the peasantry, of carving out liberated territory. They eventually established the Chinese Soviet Republic briefly during the early 1930s. They eventually then joined an alliance against the Japanese invaders. And ultimately, the Chinese Revolution happened because the Chinese Communist Party turned around. It changed its tactics very dramatically. It stopped organizing and operating in the old way. And it shifted in order to develop a strategy that applied to their conditions in that country, in that time, in order to actually move towards socialism. There would be no Russian Revolution. There would be no Chinese Revolution if they had just continued to operate in the old way. If they hadn't engaged in political innovation, and started to change the way they were operating, there would never have been socialism in Russia or in China, right? And if you look at the way things are going in the United States right now, there needs to be a shift. There needs to be a shift. The issue now, I've heard my whole life, if people were just out in the streets, things would be better. People were just out in the streets. We need average Americans to get off their butts and get out into the streets. We need big protests happening. There are big protests happening right now all across the United States. All the time, there are big protests happening, right? Or I've heard this before. We need average Americans to understand that capitalism is the problem. Well, look at the polls right now that have been coming out. Millions and millions and millions of Americans realize that capitalism is the problem. So there's millions of Americans protesting right now in the streets. There's millions of Americans who realize capitalism is the problem. But we're not getting any closer to socialism in the United States, right? And in fact, things are getting particularly bad. I noticed, that there's one of the old Trotskyite sects. I hate to pick on them, but they're not really. They may not even be around anymore to be offended by it. But the Spartacist League. Have folks ever heard of the Spartacist League? Well, the last issue of their newspaper was published back in May, and on August 18th, on their website, they announced that their publication would be irregular, and we've heard nothing from them. Right? People are out in the streets protesting. Polls show Americans are opposed to socialism. So this old Trotskyite sectarian group looks like they've dissolved because they don't even know. I mean, they don't even know what to do in a situation like this. This isn't how it's supposed to be, right? You look at a lot of these old Marxist-Leninist groups, the situation has drastically changed. For once, there is widespread anti-capitalist consciousness in the United States. For once, there is a desire to get involved in political activism. And so they don't know what to do. They just have completely fallen apart, right? And there are other groups that are trying to operate and continue to operate in the old way, but they're very confused. And a lot of the younger people who join these groups are very confused, and they don't quite know what to do. And we're facing a situation where the problem right now is not that there's a lack of activism or political involvement, especially among younger people. Younger people from this generation are more politically involved than ever before. And there's not a lack of anti-capitalist consciousness. What there is right now is there is a lack of understanding. There is a lack of ideological theory, and there's a lack of understanding what's going on, and there's a lack of a real understanding of how we can build something that can actually challenge this. And that's the situation that we're in. Now, my vision for the Center for Political Innovation is not to build a new party. It is not to build a new political organization. The idea is not to build something that's going to compete with all these groups, right? Well, don't join the DSA. Don't join the Communist Party. Don't join the PSL. You got to join the CPI. That is not what I want to do. My vision for the CPI is that it'll have people in the DSA, it'll have people in the PSL, it'll have people in the CP, it'll have people in all the different parties talking to it and listening to it. And that we will facilitate the kinds of conversations that need to happen, right? We will enable the socialist movement of the United States to turn around, to change, to move in a new direction, to get things going in a way that can actually get us out of this crisis and start moving towards socialism, because operating the old way is not going to do that. My vision is, we've started with publishing some books, right? The first book we published was The Green Book by Muammar Gaddafi. And I'll tell you, this book has been selling like crazy. And you should read the reviews of this. I mean, unbelievable. I never thought in a million years that this book would sell as many copies as it has. I also published a book on Kamala Harris. I used Kamala Harris to make a point about socialism and the leftist movement and the confusion and what it means to be left-wing in the United States. But my goal is that we would publish, in addition to publishing these books, all kinds of books. I think we ought to publish a book about the relationship between Christianity and socialism. I think we ought to publish a book about the relationship between Islam and socialism. I think we ought to publish a book about the role of Marxists in the struggle to abolish slavery in the United States. I think we ought to publish a book on Ba'athist Arab socialism and how the Arab people changed socialism and it developed a socialism for their society. I think we need to write books and publish books about Bolivarianism and hold conferences understanding how the people of South and Central America have changed socialism in order to apply it to their society, all working towards the development of a socialism with American characteristics, right? In China, they admit that their form of socialism would never work in the United States. They openly say we don't seek to impose our political system on any other country. They recognize that their socialism is a uniquely Chinese socialism. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics. Well, we need to develop a socialism with American characteristics that will apply to our country in our time and actually get us out of this nightmare that capitalism has created. That is what needs to be done. Now, not only do I want us to publish books, I want us to publish my goal, right? This is not something we can achieve overnight. My goal would be for us to publish a daily socialist briefing. If every day we put out an email briefing, with updates about what is happening in the economy, with updates about what is happening internationally, with updates about what is happening in the socialist movement, and that in this briefing, we provided inside information about what's happening in US politics, about what's happening in the economy, about what's happening internationally, inside information that nobody else had. That everybody who is interested in socialism and revolutionary politics in the United States would be, checking out our daily briefings and getting these emails and going, wow, I mean, the CPI, they just figured out that this is happening. They just figured out that this is happening. And we would keep track of all the different socialist tendencies in the United States. We would keep track of the different factions in the ruling class and monitor them. We would keep track of the developments internationally and be tracking all of it and have like the most up-to-date information that the whole socialist movement would be turning to get information from, and that we would be collecting and gathering information that would be really, really valuable, and people would be constantly turning to us for insights, right? My vision is not for us to build a cadre organization. My vision is for us to be the vanguard of the vanguard, the agitator of the agitators, right? That we will have the cutting edge information, the cutting edge research. We will be facilitating the debates and cutting edge discussions. We'll be holding big conferences around the country with different political viewpoints and different speakers, all figuring out how we can get out of the protest cage, how we can get out of the movement, out of the isolated trap of far left politics in the United States and to the masses. To the masses. How can we get to the masses? And I've been around the world. I've seen a lot of different things. I've seen people around the world in Venezuela who talk about what the socialist movement in Venezuela has meant to them. There was a woman in a collectivo in Venezuela who talked about the fact that she was a homeless child in Caracas, and she ended up getting adopted and going to an orphanage by a socialist priest. She didn't even speak Spanish. She only spoke an indigenous language, but it was through the collectivo and the socialist cooperative, that she was able to have a life and have a world. And I remember sitting there in Caracas in Venezuela and hearing this 19-year-old woman in army pants talk about how she was religious. And she believed that God had sent her to the earth with a purpose. And that purpose was to die for socialism in Venezuela, and how that she was willing to give her life to it. And I remember hearing that. And I remember, I went to Iran. And I remember, I'm one of the few Americans who's actually been in the presence of the Ayatollah of Iran, the supreme leader. I was in an auditorium with 20,000 people. And these were not wealthy people. These were working class people, working class Iranians, screaming in adoration for Khamenei, because Khamenei had built an anti-imperialist revolution, and that he stood and protected the working class people of Iran from the Western capitalist imperialists. And seeing how the Iranians and those who were loyal to the Islamic Revolution of Iran just started to sob and cry when they saw Ayatollah Khamenei walk into the room. It was a big moment. I tell people that it is a unique experience to be the only American in a room of 20,000 people who are screaming death to America, and it's a moment where it forces you to realize that America and the United States around the world has become synonymous with capitalism and greed and war and the destruction of countries. And yes, this country was founded on the genocide of Native Americans. Yes, this country was founded on slavery. This country has murdered millions of people around the world in horrendous wars. But it was in that moment that I realized that as an American, I have a responsibility. I have a responsibility to not just light an American flag on fire and say, oh, look, I'm not an American. Yeah, I F this country. My responsibility was to show people around the world that there's another side to this country. That this country, at the same time there was slavery going on, there was a mass movement to abolish slavery. There was John Brown. There was Harriet Tubman. That at the same time, all these ugly wars were happening. There were people like Eugene V. Debs. There were people like Students for a Democratic Society who were going to prison to protest these criminal wars. That at the same time that all these evil things have happened, there has been a progressive and revolutionary side to the American people. And to figure out not how I can put on a costume and pretend to be Che Guevara or pretend to be Kim Il-sung or pretend to be Mao, but how instead I can find that progressive and revolutionary side of the American people and awaken it and let America stop being synonymous with imperialism and destruction and war, and awaken the American people, the people who have been suffering, the people who've been losing their jobs, the people who've been seeing their communities destroyed, who've seen the prison industrial complex. Awaken the progressive side of the American people. How can we save America from the horror of capitalism? Because the same thing that the Wall Street monopolists and big international bankers have done to Africa and Asia and Latin America, they are doing to communities all throughout this country. Working class neighborhoods in America are being devastated right now by opioids, by unemployment, by a lack of investment in infrastructure. And the only way out of this is for the American people to awaken and rediscover the progressive side of American history. We need to awaken the sleeping giant called the American working class. And the way to do that is with solidarity against racism, solidarity against wars around the world. The American people have a progressive side, and there is hope for doing all of this. Now, I said at the beginning of this presentation that I never want to say anything I do not know. But if I know something, I feel like I have an obligation to say it as loudly as I can. I don't know that this new model that we are developing for socialist organizing is actually going to work. I don't know that. I don't know that we are guaranteed to have success with everything we do. I don't know that. But what I do know is that if we are going to get out of the mess facing this country right now, the mess of political confusion and economic destruction, that we have to turn around. We have to turn around. And that at some moments, you reach a moment in your life sometimes where you're going to have to choose. And you're going to have to choose. All of us are going to have to choose. Are we going to continue to organize in the old way, or are we going to start engaging in political innovation? That is what my vision is for us to do. Now, I want to just end by talking about one thing, which is that I think that this pandemic has been particularly hard on a lot of us because of the fact that already in the United States, we're a very deeply alienated society. People are not connected with each other. People don't have a sense of community. People don't have a sense of belonging. There's a coldness. You know, families don't have the care for one another that they once had. Communities can feel like very alienating places. We're all encouraged to compete with each other. We're all encouraged to celebrate each other's failures, to mock each other, to lampoon each other. Everyone is competing with everyone else. Everyone looks down on other people. There's just an ugly atmosphere that's been created where just every form of division and isolation seems to be imposed on people. So if you add to that the fact that we're all social distancing right now, the fact that, you know, students are still having school from home in many parts of the country, the fact that we can't have big public gatherings, that the sense of community and the sense of oneness that human beings naturally long for has been so robbed from people. And there's so many people that are suffering right now. They're just in deep pain because they have lost their connections with other people. And it's hard for people because when it gets down to it, you know, liberalism, the ideology that the Western capitalist system has really promoted, it believes that individualism should come before all else, that human beings should think of themselves as individuals. You can either speak of all humanity or you can speak of the individual, but you can never speak of the collective. You can never speak of the group, right? It breaks down any sense of group identity. And that this is completely foolish because human beings are collective creatures in nature. And not only are human beings collective creatures, but they are progressive creatures. You know, ants are collective creatures, but they have been building their ant farms the same way for thousands and thousands of years. Beavers are collective creatures. They've been building their beaver dams the same way for thousands and thousands of years. But human beings, not only are we collective, but it's through our collectivity that our brilliance is enacted. It's human beings coming together that took humanity from, you know, caves to space travel, from rocks and dust to iPhones and iPads. Look at every building in the New York City skyline. Look at every great achievement that's been created. That is human beings coming together, collectively working together around a common vision to build something beautiful. We are a progressive species and we are a collective species. And the problem is that at this point, human beings, we have been infected with the free market and with capitalism, with the system of profits and command. And it's time for human reason and rational thinking to take control. That the word revolution itself, right? The word revolution, it originally referred to the fact that the earth is revolving around it, right? The earth revolves around the sun. That's the root of the word. And it was people who didn't go along with the Roman Catholic Church and their belief that the earth was the center of the universe. The people who called themselves revolutionaries were the people who believed in science and understood that actually the earth revolves. That's where the root of the word revolutionary came from. Now, after the events in France in the late 1700s, it became a political term, but originally it was a scientific term for how you understood the universe. And that points to the essence of what a revolution is. A revolution is not an act of violence and chaos. A revolution is not an act of destruction. Revolution is an understanding that science must be applied to humanity and that rational thinking can be applied to society and society can be reorganized in a rational way. And that is what the word revolution means. The term revolution is about applying science to the human condition. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation aims to do, to apply science and scientific thinking to how we can get out of this crisis. So I've said a lot in the past hour. I've said quite a bit, but I want to end, since I just told you that, that revolution has a very different meaning than what we're told. Now that I've explained the real meaning of the word revolution, I want to end the way I end all my lives by reciting a very, very important statement, one of the final statements of Chairman Mao Zedong, the author of the Little Red Book. He said, "A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today." And that concludes my remarks. So on that note, I think we just want to go to a Q&A, right? So who wants to ask the first question? I know we have some questions prepared. There are probably some questions in the chat. Raise your hand if you're ready to ask your question. All right, Lily, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm Lily. I'm a high school student in Atlanta, Georgia, and I just had a question. This is probably not unique to where I am, but when I go out and I'm driving around, I see homeless people all the time. So my question is kind of, how would a socialist government take action and deal with the homelessness issue? And is there anything we can do in the meantime?
Okay. So I'm writing that down. Homelessness issue. Do we want to have another question, perhaps? And feel free to introduce yourselves. That was very good, Lily's introduction. So homelessness is the first question. Let's have another question. Sam, why don't you go ahead?
Hello. So I'm a tenant in Los Angeles and currently between jobs as a server and background actor. My question is based on the fact that more and more I'm meeting, or over and over, I'm meeting neighbors who seem open to the idea of raising the living standard as a whole, but won't commit to continuous study. And I figure that the things that are they're under the impression that that they're still free to make individual decisions and choices in the situation. And so the closest people to home are having issues with patients around discussing alternative ideas or alternative programs and worldviews. So this is happening even when I'm presenting economic facts that are directly impacting us and holding us back in terms of our development and day-to-day life. So my question is, how can we reach our neighbors so that they see that the work to achieve our aim of freedom and equality throughout society is work that all working families have to do necessarily, and not something that they can look to for a very, very small group of people to do as some sort of form of charity or social service that happens in their meantime. And I know that the talks have touched upon this. If it's what we can do beyond presenting people with books, or is it food and books, or tapping into people's interests beyond, or tapping into what people are interested in applying the ideas through that way. So that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, and while I answer this, if somebody could look, if there people have been following the chat, can somebody, maybe Dust, would you be willing to look through the chat and see if there's any questions from the chat that we should raise? Can you do that, Dust, while I answer this? See if there's any questions from the chat that we ought to address next, and then address the question from folks on here. Does that sound good?
Sure. You want me to read them from the chat?
Yeah. After I answer this, I'll ask you to read a couple questions from the chat, so we can answer those. Now, you know, Lily asked about homelessness and the homelessness in the community, and then it was a very similar question from Sam, where he was asking about, you know, in his struggles around housing, how can he impact people who don't seem to be committed to regular study. And I think that what's important is that we need to develop a community that people can feel like they are a part of. You know, in any other country in the world, the communist political organizations, they have neighborhoods where they take care of people and they provide services to people and they provide them with education, and they also are well known in the community. right, in the neighborhood, right? Everyone knows who the communists are in the neighborhood, and they take care of people. And if you've got a problem in the neighborhood, you can go to them. But on top of that, there are regular communist events that people go to, right? There are regular forums, there are regular speeches. There, often there is free food distributed at these events. It's not simply a charitable organization. It's not simply just giving stuff away. It's the fact that they built kind of a community around their ideas, but also around community service. The communists are the ones who are involved in the community. They're providing for people's needs. They're advocating for people in the community, but they're also conducting regular events and educating people. And, as far as commitment to study, I think that in some cases, the best way for someone to learn something is through teaching it. I, in my life, when I've been assigned to lead a discussion group over a topic, I'll go out and I will go and do the research on that topic and learn all about it in order to teach it to somebody else. And that people that might not be interested in just sitting there and listening to somebody else, give a presentation on it. You really want to teach somebody something, have them give a presentation on it, assign them to give a presentation on it. I think that's very important. And that, books are great, but we live in a very illiterate society. Let's be real about that. People don't read in the United States, right? Those of us who read books, we're kind of a minority. People get their information from social media. They get their information from television. I think it's great that Dust James has a YouTube channel and is doing great work on there. I think it's really, really great that the folks at TwinkRev have their broadcasts. And I feel like all of us should try to increase our social media content. But the main thing I feel like is we need to build community, right? It can't simply be an internet thing. It's about building an in real life community where we can be providing for people, where people can learn to depend on each other. Because as the economy gets worse, people are going to have to depend on each other even more, right? When people are struggling, when people don't have jobs, they're going to depend on each other. And so we need to build a community centered around these ideas that can be kind of a safety net for people, where people can have friends who can help them out when they're struggling, where people can learn to depend on each other. It's about building a community. And at the same time, providing people with something to believe in, with an ideology. It's frustrating. Right now, during the pandemic, we obviously have to follow health code regulations. The last thing we'd want to do is have an event where people are spreading. We were going to have a very great conference in New York City in April. We had to cancel it because of the pandemic. And we'd like to do one as soon as the pandemic is over. We were also hoping to have an event in Southern California. But, obviously with things as they are right now, we couldn't do it. I'd like us to have retreat weekends where, in some part of the country, we spend 3 or 4 days together as a community. And not only do we engage in education and have classes and stuff, but we also, do some socialist singing. We do some kind of fun group building activities where we build a core of people who are connected to each other and dedicated to these principles and these ideas, dedicated to turning things around. We need to build a community that can take care of people who are in need, a community that people feel like they can depend on, but also is centered around very, very key principles. That's my beliefs. And we're going to figure out how we do it in the process of doing it, right? It's going to be a gradual process, trial and error. We're going to try some things and they're not going to work. But we're going to try some things and they're going to work. And we're going to figure out why it didn't work or why it did work. And we're going to learn via trial and error. We're going to be scientific. We're not just going to keep doing what we've always been doing and assume that it'll eventually just work, right? We're past that, right? We're past that. The situation in the country is desperate. It's way too desperate to keep trying to do that. So that's my answer to those questions. So what do we have from the chat, Dust?
Okay. Let's see. We have one from, sorry if I don't get the names right, Scene Hazy. Will there be policy papers written by the CPI and put on the website? Okay. Estatist, how will the CPI strengthen international cooperation? Will Lotz, continuing, how do we defeat the synthetic left? Poppy Chulo, what will CPI do exactly? Will it be international? And that's what I've got written.
Synthetic left. All right. And what will we do? What will we do exactly? That's a good question. Okay. So in terms of policy papers, yes. I think that developing policy papers, engaging in real, actual research, right? That's one thing I would like to do. Is we should we should have members find issues in the country and start doing research on it and find information. And we should be, again, putting out the most cutting-edge information. My vision is that we would have a daily briefing that would go out every single day, and that people could subscribe to that briefing, and that anyone in the United States who's interested in socialism would be getting this daily briefing and seeing the information that CPI is compiling, right? People would be coming to us because we have this very, very valuable information, and that we have our ear to the ground. We're keeping track of real trends. This is what the Heritage Foundation does for the bourgeoisie. This is what the Council on Foreign Relations does for the bourgeoisie, right? This is what the American Enterprise Institute does for the bourgeoisie. It's time that the working class had a think tank of its own that had the most advanced and cutting edge information and was feeding that information to those who want to build a better world. Now, as far as the question of defeating the synthetic left, I think that it's important that we not have a confrontational approach, right? That's the perfect way to isolate ourselves. And that's the last thing we want, right? And if we go in and I thought it was very interesting, Mihail's presentation about the conflicts going on inside of the DSA, right? Very interesting, to hear what's going on between this Red Star faction and these social democratic factions, the people that control Jacobin. And I think the more information we can dig up about who these factions are in DSA and who they represent and who they're tied to, and who's funding them and what agendas they have is very important. But at the same time, I would encourage those of us who are members of DSA not to get in a fight, not to get in a confrontation. Because at the end of the day, DSA is going to be run by the people who run DSA, right? And that if we go in there and look like we're trying to set up a fight and a factional fight, it'll be very easy to isolate us. But wouldn't it be great, though, if in everyone's local DSA chapter, whenever there was something big and cutting edge in the news, like Venezuela or what's been going on, internationally, or what's been going on in the country, that they turned to the CPI people for information, right? If we were a voice whispering in the ear of the entire DSA, providing our information and our analysis, right? That would be brilliant. If every time we turned around, every time there was a big situation, we had a new book on it that they would read, people would read and learn all kinds of things about it. When there was, there were new, proposals in terms of policy, we would have our website with new policy proposals and demands that were being posted, right? That we wouldn't be a faction competing for power with all the different leftist groups. We would rather be a source of thought and a source of cutting edge political innovation. Right. And that would be the way to change things by being willing to engage with anybody and provide information with anybody and constantly making ourselves more valuable because of intellectual research and academic work that we are doing. Now, in terms of international cooperation, I must absolutely say that right now there is an urgent need to get American working people in general, but most especially American socialists and people that are leftists, to understand that neither Russia or China is their enemy, and that there is some COINTELPRO stuff going on right now. Let's be real, right? The New York Times, they ran an article, not an article, but like a video production that they made attacking China's healthcare system. And it was exposed by the journalist Nathan Rich. Now, why do you think they picked the issue of healthcare to attack China? Why? Because that's an issue that's very, very important to Bernie Sanders supporters. And the idea that was to send a message to people in the United States who want single-payer healthcare that China is not your friend, and that video was full of lies. I mean, they mistranslated people on purpose. Nathan Rich, the journalist, ripped it to shreds. It was a lie, but it was aimed at socialists. There's a reason, the New York Times will run continuous articles, right? Young Marxists arrested in China. Why do they do that? It's aimed at Marxists in the United States. China is your enemy. And it's like, it'd be funny. It'd be like, imagine an article in China, young capitalist arrested in China, or arrested in the United States, right? I mean, it would be ridiculous, right? I mean, China, the ruling ideology is communism. So the idea that somebody who believes in communism might get arrested, if you really think about it, is not a scandal. There's probably more to the story than that. We don't know. Was it a justified arrest or not? There's more to the story than simply this young person believed in Marxism and got arrested. But there's a reason that they plant stories like that. This is an operation. It is about trying to do what the capitalists were very successful in doing in the lead up to World War I, which is get the socialist movement and get advocates for the working class at home to be advocates of war and international tension abroad, right? They want to transform believers in socialism, instead of being fighters for peace, instead of being fighters for international friendship and cooperation and international solidarity. They want to mobilize leftists to promote the idea that a war with China or a war with Russia would be a good thing because Russia and China are a bunch of phonies and they're all racist and sexist and homophobic or whatever. And we have to combat that. That doesn't mean we should blindly apologize for everything that these countries do. That doesn't mean we should simply we should never deny that bad things happen over there, or that we should be lobbyists for a foreign government or something like that. I would never advocate such a thing. But we need to push back against the efforts in left-wing circles to cultivate a warlike mentality, because that's what they're doing. I mean, certain voices have been highlighted on the internet to represent socialist and Marxist thought, and their main message is, young people, oh, you're interested in socialism? Russia's your enemy. China's your enemy. Anyone who defends Russia and China is a secret Nazi, right? This is being consciously done. The ruling class knows what they're doing. Right? The synthetic left was created consciously, right? The Congress for Cultural Freedom. There's a whole history of that, of trying to maneuver and manipulate the socialist movement to serve Wall Street imperialism and tearing down countries around the world. So we need to consciously and carefully push back against that, but not do so in a way that will isolate us, because, there's going to be people that would like to isolate it. There's already people that think, that this is, I'm trying to start a new party, right? That's out there, right? Oh, Caleb's just trying to start a new party. Well, I'm not trying to start a new party. Right? There are people watching right now who are in all kinds of different political tendencies. And that's absolutely fine with me. And that's what I want, right? And I want us to be the cutting edge in every single one of these organizations, right? I want us to have cutting edge information that will be useful to every single one of these organizations. But ultimately, I want us to get out of that little tiny leftist activist milieu and get to the masses. And that's going to require political innovation. So I hope that answers those 4 questions. Go ahead, Max.
Hello, my name is Max. I am a youth from Virginia, and my question is the following: the current climate crisis is a threat to the world and humanity as a whole. Amongst the Generation Z, this crisis is a very foreboding issue. As a result, there has been a mental health crisis amongst youth. Many cope with drugs, drinking, and other antisocial behaviors. You can see this, and I have personally seen it, in the bathrooms, as my fellow youth express their alienation in the form of a vape pen between classes. Many are depressed, alienated, and even suicidal. Generation Z is looking for a way out of this crisis and is open to ideological direction. So, playing devil's advocate, and as a representative of my generation, what would socialism have to offer in comparison to capitalism in terms of solutions to climate change? I think
it's brilliant that in your question, Max, you linked the mental health crisis and the climate crisis. Because I think that when it comes to the climate crisis, the main answer, the main solution to the climate crisis that's being offered by the voices representing big capital is an answer that is resulting in a mental health crisis, right? So yeah, we got the far right wing, and they say that climate change isn't real. Oh, it's all made up. Climate change isn't real. It snowed last summer. It snowed last winter. It can't be real. Climate change is all made up. It's a communist conspiracy to hurt my profits. But aside from that, right, the main voices highlighting the very real problems of climate change, the main voices that are doing it, they have come forward and they have said the answer to the climate crisis is reducing human consumption, right, and reducing the human population. Barack Obama actually went to South Africa and said that if everyone on the continent had a house and a car, that it would destroy the planet, and basically told the people of Africa that they had to stay poor because of the climate crisis. And that we're constantly being told, don't have children, don't grow up because that'll hurt, Mother Nature. And the answer to the climate crisis is an end of historical progress. And if you are a young person and society is telling you that there is no future, don't have children, don't try to increase your living standard. We need living standards to go down. We need the human population to go down. We need to move backwards. The human race has gone too far. That is a very depressing message. You can't live your life with that message. You can't go through life being told you need to be poorer. You can't go through life being told that humanity has gone too far. And that message is completely wrong. The answer to climate change is not an end to human progress. It is not reducing the human population. It is not driving down living standards. The answer to the climate crisis is progress. We have to get away from the prison called fossil fuels, right? Fossil fuels is a prison for humanity, and we need to get to a higher fuel source, not just nuclear power, but fusion power. And the fact that Russia and China are now calling for international cooperation around fusion energy, that is the optimistic hope for the climate crisis. If we could get to a global economy that is not centered around oil, right, and get to a mode of producing energy that was not one that would result in the climate crisis and the greenhouse gas effect, we could get to a much better world, right? We could solve this problem very quickly. Look, folks, the reason that moon mission, right, the Chang'e moon mission was so important is because on the far side of the moon, there is a substance that they call helium-3. And it's very rare, on Earth that you'll find helium-3. But it's all over the far side of the moon. They sometimes call it the dark side of the moon, but it's not dark, but it's the far side of the moon. And it's all over the far side of the moon. And helium-3, if it could be utilized in fusion energy, would be a huge game changer, right? I mean, they talk about just a little bit of helium-3 could electrify the entire planet for 100 years, right? The potential of helium-3 is massive. And that the fossil fuel economy, if you look at Wall Street, all the big banks, right, are tied to oil companies, right? ExxonMobil, that's Chase Bank. HSBC Bank, that's British Petroleum, right? That keeping the world on fossil fuels is a way that Wall Street and London can stay at the center of the global economy. But getting humanity off of fossil fuels and getting to a higher fuel source that is not going to heat up the planet is a way out, not just of the climate crisis, but of capitalism. And that's why they don't want to have the conversation about a real solution to climate change. They want to have a Malthusian conversation. They want to have a reducing consumption conversation. Really, the entire ruling class seems to agree that we need to drive down living standards right now. The question is, how do we do it, right? Do we let the free market work its course, get rid of the minimum wage, get rid of social programs, austerity, and just cut everybody and let everyone starve on the street? Or do we do it in a gradual, controlled way? We give everyone a little bit of universal basic income, put some Netflix series out that encourage people to commit suicide, just make, gradually tell people there's no hope. And do we gradually, just have a controlled, careful reduction in human living standards and the human population? Or do we have a free market austerity regime? That's the difference. But the whole bourgeoisie seems to agree that the working people have too much. That's what they agree on. And the socialist movement says, no, the problem is that profits are in command. The problem is that capitalism is in command, and human beings are capable of inventing higher modes of production, higher fuel sources, conquering outer space, doing things that are amazing, right? That you have to imagine what's going on right now. Imagine there's a game of King of the Mountain, right? And one kid gets to the top and he says, oh, we got to stop the game. We got to stop the game, climate change. But that's what they're doing, right? They've decided the solution to climate change must leave them at the top of the world. Well, the solution to climate change is to get them off the top of the world and get working people in power. That's the solution to climate change. And that's an optimistic message. And there's a lot of fake, stupid optimism in the United States, right? Is the glass half empty or half full? There's a lot of stupid optimism. So the reason I think a lot of young people are put off by optimism is because there's so much of this stupid, how to win friends and influence people. Gee golly, anyone can get rich if they just talk. There's a lot of stupid optimism. So, I don't want to give you stupid optimism. I want to give you an optimism that says that by understanding the nature of the universe, dialectical and historical materialism, we can get beyond the horrors of the present world. So that's what I'm about. But we got a few more questions now. I'm going to look here in the chat because there's a couple that have gone by. I don't want to forget anybody. So let's see. Okay, so we got. So I guess Jason has a question, right? And Jacob, Jason, Jacob, and then Lily. Why don't you all do your questions one after another?
Hi, my name is Jason. I live in the Bay Area with my wife and daughter. One thing that we've noticed is we grew up in the city that we live in, my wife and I, and we'll often take our daughter to play at a park or some kind of recreational center where me and my wife used to play when we were kids. And what we've noticed is just this complete dilapidation, that maintenance doesn't get done anymore. Things that once were upkept aren't. And this seems to be a trend that is going on all over the country. There's water not being purified, like in Flint and other towns. There's bridges that are falling apart and need to be restructured. So I was just wondering if you could talk about how capitalism has both led to these problems and failed to amend them, and how socialism in the U.S. could amend these problems.
Very good. Okay. Next, we got Jacob.
Yeah, I just wanted to give y'all a super chat that I think we may have missed from Nick B. He asked, what is your position on minimum wage? I have a friend who says that increasing minimum wage will increase inflation. How do I argue otherwise?
All right, and Lily.
Yeah, so the last question was kind of more material, and this is more ideological. So, Caleb, you've spoken about your 4 points to transition to socialism before, and I really like these points, but some of the things you say, they sound kind of similar to what FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, did, and some of the things he wanted to do before he died. So I guess my question is, what's the difference between socialism and kind of progressive liberalism, and how do we differentiate ourselves from that?
Okay, so in terms of crumbling infrastructure, I think it's interesting that the bourgeoisie on some level knows they need an infrastructure, right? They know that. You know, if people don't drive down the roads, they can't go get to stores and buy their products, right? That if the electricity doesn't work, they can't have electricity to run their power plants or to run their factories. Right? If the water isn't properly purified, members of all classes are going to drink impure water. And Obama promised that he was going to fix the infrastructure, and he didn't. And Trump promised that he was going to fix the infrastructure, and he didn't. And the reason that none of the capitalists are able to resolve this, even though they all want it, is because they all want another section of the ruling class to pay for it. Right? That's what they want. They all want it to be done. They just don't want to have to pay for it. Right? The Trump capitalists, the lower levels of capital, they don't want to have to pay for it. The Obama and the higher levels of capital, they don't want to have to pay for it. And that to force other sections of the capitalist class to pay for it requires an amount of Bonapartist political suppression, right? That you're going to need some kind of strong state power to beat down the other section of the capitalist class and force them to pay for it. Roosevelt, during the 1930s, he aligned himself with the Rockefeller family, and he beat down the National Association of Manufacturers and Henry Ford and Henry Morgan and forced them to pay for things like Social Security and unemployment insurance, right? And he forced them to accept, factory unions. He was aligned with one section of the ruling class. He built a mass movement to beat down another section of the ruling class. And that's what Bonapartism is. It's when there's a capitalist crisis, the capitalists fight among themselves about who is going to have to pay for the Bonapartist mechanisms in order to resolve it. And I talked in my presentation about Nazi Germany, right? That was a Bonapartist regime that represented Krupp and Tyson and certain industrial interests in Germany. And they seized control of the government, and they used the government to beat the crap out of the rest of the ruling class and force them to take measures that would, stabilize the economy. And that's why in a time of capitalist crisis, capitalist societies tend to move in a more fascistic direction. Because they need, a more authoritarian state to control members of their own class. That's basically what it's about. Now, that's why we have this infrastructure problem, and that a socialist society would mobilize the population to build. And I mean, imagine, the Democrats, they've had this proposal that they call the, what do they call it? The National Service Initiative. And it sounds great. Like every young person would be encouraged to do some community service. What it is austerity, right? If they would lay off postal workers, they would lay off sanitation workers, they would lay off school teachers, and they would have young people who are still, getting supported by their parents do all their work for free, right? They would eliminate all these good-paying government jobs and have young people do it for free for the good of the country, guys, right? Be patriotic. That's the Democrats' proposal. It's awful. But imagine if something like Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration were to really be proposed, right? If there was a mass state-led effort to rebuild the country. And I've raised, the 4 points that I've raised as policy solutions that would move the USA closer to socialism would be a mass program of reconstruction of the country, public control of oil and gas, public control of banking, and the guaranteeing of an economic bill of rights. Now, on the surface, those four things alone do not create socialism, right? They don't, right? I mean, I think Norway has all four of those things, right? But in the United States, they don't have the banking thing in Norway, but the other three they have. But in order to enact that in the United States, you would have to build such a mass powerful movement to overturn and push back so much capitalist power that in order to do that, you would be turning the tides to the working class being the leaders of the government, right? And that's the nature of the transitional demand, right? The Russian Revolution, for example, was not fought on the basis of fight for communism. The Russian Revolution happened because the Bolsheviks were known as the people who want to end the war. It was peace, land, and bread, but peace was the main thing. The Bolsheviks were the anti-war guys, right? And that's what they were known as. They are the party that wants to end the war. And at that point, the big question was, are we for the war? Or are we against it? The bourgeoisie of Russia was divided. Some wanted to continue World War I. Some wanted to oppose it. A section of the ruling class that wanted to brutally suppress the anti-war sections of the capitalist class picked General Kornilov to be the military dictator who would continue Russia's involvement in World War I. And so the other section of the capitalist class that was against the war desperately turned to the Bolsheviks, who had a huge organization to protect them from Kornilov and his attempt to establish a military regime. The Bolsheviks defeated the Kornilov reaction. And at that point, they were so powerful that they were able to become the government, right? And that it was a divide over the war that created the Russian Revolution. If you read, it's very interesting. Kim Il-sung, his radio address when he's creating North Korea or creating the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, you read it, it's really basic. It's really basic stuff. He says, we want to give everyone health care, and we want to confiscate the property of all Japanese collaborators. And that's about it, right? I mean, it's not a really radical program, but only the communists could enact it. Only the Korean Workers' Party really had the strength to enact that program of creating a healthcare system and confiscating the property of people who had cooperated and collaborated with the Japanese occupiers. That often a transitional demand, it's not in and of itself. The demand itself is not what creates socialism. It is the polarization of society and the confrontation these demands creates that sets the stage for the working class to become the leaders. And in order to enact those four demands in the United States, in order to really enact those four things, not gradually over the course of 100 years, but if you had a government that came into office promising to control banking, rebuild the country, control oil, and guarantee everyone an economic bill of rights, the ruling class would mobilize like crazy against it, but millions of working people would rally behind it, and you would have a confrontation where the working class would have to take power. That is how a transitional program tends to work. And that is why I have proposed that. And Roosevelt's economic reforms didn't really challenge property, right? If you're saying the government should control natural gas, if you're saying the government should have a state monopoly on the lending of money, that is something that is challenging capitalist property relations, right? I mean, you can't have capitalism without private lending of money at interest. You can't have capitalism without private oil companies. I mean, the oil companies of the United States rule the world. So at that point, you would be, overturning the foundations of the American capitalist system. As far as the minimum wage, well, there's a very good pamphlet that Karl Marx wrote where he talked about there was some socialists that were arguing that you shouldn't argue for an increase in wages because it'll just cause inflation. And they called this theory the iron law of wages. And Karl Marx, in his pamphlet, very carefully dissected that argument with mathematics and just showed how if workers' wages increase, it doesn't naturally result in inflation. That's simply an economic myth. And if you look at throughout U.S. history, when there were strong labor unions and stuff, if the auto workers get a 2% raise, that doesn't make the price of cars go up by 2% automatically. There are many, many factors that go into the cost of cars other than just what auto workers get paid. And so this is fallacious free market thinking, right? There's all of this malarkey about economics is out there, right? Libertarian, Austrian school, Chicago school economics is a joke. It is laughed at by academic economists. It's not real economic theory, okay? But there has been loads and loads and loads of money pumped into this silly Milton Friedman thinking, where you get arguments like, oh, if there wasn't a minimum wage, there'd be full employment. Everyone would have a job. Or hey, if the government just completely deregulated everything, we would have a free market paradise and it would work. And this is a joke, right? I mean, this stuff doesn't work. It's been widely refuted, and the whole history of academic economics is trying to correct the problems created, the natural problems created by the market just taking its course. So, I think there's a term they talk about, the benevolent market hypothesis and all of this. The market just naturally solves all problems. It doesn't, right? And that minimum wages don't result in mass inflation. And that this is one of the lies that's been pushed on us. So we got a few more questions here, right? Someone, Dust James wants to read Gavin's question, right?
Yes. There's a youth group for Center for Political Innovation. It's Students and Youth for a New America. I recently interviewed Gavin Lockhart on my show, and he has a question. Among many new socialists, a new line is being pushed that claims socialism has nothing to do with state policy. How do we fight that idea that socialism is just some employee stock program?
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I want to give a great shout out to Gavin and to Students and Youth for a New America, because, it's an organization that's been around for a little while. It's not a very big organization, but I started giving classes in New York City to some college students at New School University. And they built, kind of a study group. And then through some very strange turns of events, an activist from Students and Youth for a New America got to appear on Tucker Carlson and defend Venezuela. His name's Dakota Lillard, and he actually appeared on Tucker Carlson and exposed the Venezuelan CIA-backed opposition as terrorists on national television. Millions of people saw this on Tucker Carlson. And Gavin, he's somebody in Illinois who's been organizing the Students and Youth for a New America. I think someone needs to mute, if they can mute, we're getting some feedback. He's been organizing, and he's been, on the campus. He has an official established community college organization on his campus, and he has been relentless in pushing socialism with American characteristics and building the Students and Youth for a New America clubs. And if you're on a campus and you have the ability to set up a campus organization, I would encourage you to set up a Students and Youth for a New America club on your campus, right? And then that can be a wing on the campuses of this effort that we're building. So I would encourage you to do that. Check out the great interview Dust James did with Gavin Lockhart about Students and Youth for a New America. The organization is still alive. We've sent delegates to Venezuela. We've sent delegates to Ukraine, to East Ukraine, where the people of Ukraine are resisting fascism. It's a great group. Now, as far as this question about socialism, isn't it just if every company is a cooperative? No, because capitalism is profits in command. And if you have a cooperative, that's good because no one's being exploited, right? Every worker gets a share of the profits. So that's good. But the cooperative is still functioning according to the profit motive, right? A corporation that pollutes, might still want to pollute because it would be in the economic interest of all those workers who are the owners to pollute. Imagine if the military industrial complex, for example, were set up, as worker cooperatives. How much more pro-war would the people who worked at Boeing and General Electric and Raytheon be, right? That profits in command is the essence of the problem. And that you don't get rid of the anarchy of production, right? When people lose jobs because of technology, that could happen in cooperatives as well, right? They would want fewer workers because everyone would get a bigger share in their share of the profits. So the problem with capitalism is profits in command. You need human reason and rational central planning to control the means of production. It's better. I think worker cooperatives are great. I think there's a role for worker cooperatives in a socialist society. I also think there's a role for private business, right? I think private hotels, private restaurants, private hair salons have a role in a socialist society. But ultimately, the essence of socialism is eliminating production for profit. It is a system where the state and rational human reason controls the means of production. And there are many different forms of socialism. And I think that's the essence of what it is. All right, so I saw that there's a question from Australia, I believe, right?
Yes. Comrade David Fox, which I did a great study with on the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster, has a question. It says, what practical activities can everyone do to support each other internationally?
Wow. Well, I think an important thing would be to start convening international events, right? We ought to have our next call, we ought to have an international speaker on it. I think it'd be great if somebody from Australia were on our next call to give a presentation about the similarities and differences in the class struggle of Australia versus the class struggle of the United States. I think it would be great, if there would be, conference calls and events like this where we had speakers from different countries around the world. I think that would be great. And the more that we can be cooperating, I talk about the synthetic left. One thing that David Fox has pointed out in many of his comments and his videos is they have the exact same problem in Australia, the exact same problem we're facing in the United States with the synthetic left and the distortion of leftist politics. The exact same thing is happening in Australia. I think we should organize future calls. Now, this was a test run tonight. This is the first one we've done, the first Zoom conference we've done. I think this was a success. I see hundreds of people watching this live. I heard great dynamic presentations from people, great music. This has been a great event. And I think our next one is going to be even better. And our next one, I think we should tackle topics that'll get people interested in. I don't know what our next one will be, but we're going to have a Zoom call pretty soon. If you want to get involved, shoot me an email, calebmaupin@gmail.com, no periods or spaces. Get involved and let's plan our next Zoom educational conference, right? Let's do it, right? We've had a successful event tonight. Let's plan another one and let's include an international speaker in the next one. Let's pick a topic that'll be cutting edge, that'll grab people's attention. I think that would be great. It looks like we are reaching the time to conclude. So it has been an amazing, amazing night. And I actually am hoping that Max will end this conference the way he started it, by playing the Internationale on his saxophone, reminding us of the beautiful traditions that have been part of everything we're about. I do want to say this, before you play the Internationale, Max, I don't know if people know this, but, in the communist movement, people salute each other like this, the fist salute, right? Where did that come from? Well, just like the Internationale, that came from the Paris Commune. And when the Paris Commune was being defeated, they lined up various people who had been revolutionary fighters in the Commune, and they shot them. It was like a firing squad. And before they were being shot, they all did this. They held their fists up like this. And then they would dump their bodies into graves. And the executioners would look on in horror because of something called rigorous mortem. And as the dead bodies were there in the graves, the fists would come up out of the ground. And the fist from the Paris Commune became the symbol of revolutionary immortality, the symbol of the power of the ideas that built the Paris Commune. And the Paris Commune also brought us the Internationale, right? And what we're doing here, we are continuing a great tradition, right? That this is the tradition that raised millions of people around the world out of poverty, that turned Russia and China into superpowers, that built the civil rights movement in the United States, that is the reason that workers in factories in the United States once had decent wages, that is the reason that women in this country get to vote. What we're doing here is we are rescuing Marxism and the tradition of science and revolution from the synthetic left, from the phonies, from the forces of destruction that have kind of hijacked it during the late Cold War. We are on the cutting edge here of doing something really, really powerful. This conference that we're having is a lot like that fist rising up out of the ground. That's what we're about. That's what we're all about. And I want to thank everyone who helped make this dynamic conversation happen. We are on the cutting edge of some really beautiful stuff that's going to happen. So on that note, I want to thank everyone for all the hard work they've done. Shout out to Justin Simons, who's been managing this call from Los Angeles, doing great work, managing things in the chat. Thanks to everybody who's involved. Max, take it away with the Internationale, and then we'll be done.
Night, everybody.
Night,